Hey everyone, welcome, and thanks for giving us a little bit of time to just unpack some great leadership principles that we see from God's Word that are so applicable to every area of our life, in family, in the church, and of course in the rest of our world and lives together. And today I want to talk about how we think about leadership and life and how we lead when we are going through successive seasons of struggle, of hardship, or even when we end up repeating our own mistakes. We're going to call it a double dip. I don't know how many of you guys are Seinfeld fans, but there's an old Seinfeld episode where George Costanza is at a wake and he walks over and he double dips a chip at the bar. And the guy standing next to him freaks out. It turns into this big altercation. And I remember thinking how dumb that was, but now that idea of double dipping has just become ubiquitous within our culture. We all know that term, that phrase. But the reality is most of us who have been in leadership for any length of time, we also have experienced what feels like double dips in our leadership, double dips in our team, double dips in our marriages. And so how do we lead during seasons of successive struggle? There's actually a really great illustration about this. Peter is one of the most prolific characters that constantly sort of found himself embroiled in one kind of issue or another. And there's an amazing story in the end of John's Gospel in chapter 21. It's after Jesus' death and resurrection. He has appeared a couple times to the disciples, but it has created such uncertainty that Peter just gets to the place where all of the disciples have migrated north out of Jerusalem. They've all gone back to Galilee, kind of where their roots are. And Peter one day just sort of throws his hands up in the air and says, "I'm going fishing." And many of the disciples that were there with him said, "Hey, we'll go too." So they go and they fish all night and they catch nothing. Well, in the morning, as the sun is coming up, they see a man standing on the edge of the lake, the edge of the sea. And he says to them, "Hey, how are you guys doing tonight? Have you caught anything?" And they said, "No, we haven't had any luck." And he says, "Well, throw your nets over on the right side of your boat." And as soon as they do, immediately the nets are filled to tearing. And immediately one of the disciples says, "That's got to be Jesus." Peter jumps out of the boat, swims, walks, makes his way over to where Jesus is, and then there is the setting for the story that we're all so familiar with, where Jesus is talking to Peter after his denial, and he says to him, "Do you love me?" And 3 times he poses the question. And what's so amazing about this story is that it is filled with imagery from other moments in the life of Peter. And so all at once, things that we maybe would miss their significance, these ideas are crashing in Peter's psyche. So the first thing is when Jesus very first met Peter, Luke chapter 5 tells us that it was on the same coast of the same sea where they are now, near Peter's hometown. Jesus came walking down the sea. He saw 2 empty boats. He stepped into one of them and asked the owner, who happened to be Simon Peter, to push out into the water a little bit while he talked to the crowds. And he talked to the crowds. And it was in the same way, it was the morning after a fruitless night of fishing where Peter had turned up empty-handed. After Jesus had talked to the crowds for a bit, he encouraged Peter to push out into the deeper water. And Peter sort of resists and he doesn't want to do it, but he's gracious and he's kind, despite the fact that it seems like such a waste of time. It was already fruitless last night. This isn't the time to be fishing, but he does it anyway. And just like there at the end of John's Gospel, he comes up with a massive catch. In fact, he has to ask for his partners, John and James Zebedee, to come out in their boat and help him bring the catch in. That's why when they experience this again, immediately John is the one who recognizes that man on the beach has to be Jesus. I've lived through this once before. Peter, in that first encounter, immediately fell to his knees and said, "Please, would you go away from me because I'm a sinful man?" Peter, in the presence of Jesus, recognized sort of the difference. What his life had been like without Jesus, what his life had been like up to that moment. It had been fruitless. And now that Jesus had stepped in, all of a sudden he could tell everything had changed. And the one thing that he was so desperate for the night before, a full boat of fish, he now walks away from without seeming any concern. And not only him, but Andrew, his brother, and his two partners, James and John, they do the exact same thing. So now, sitting there this morning as they're eating the fish, Jesus is reminding Peter of what his life was like before Jesus, and he's giving him a glimpse, a hint, of what life moving forward would be like again if he chose to go down that same path. Not only that, but John tells us that Jesus specifically is cooking his fish over a charcoal fire. It's a very specific word that only appears one other time in all of the New Testament. And it actually appears when Jesus, or when Peter is denying Jesus standing around a fire. He had already denied knowing Jesus a couple times, and now he finds himself at a fire warming himself, a charcoal fire. And a little girl comes up and presses him until he just curses to try to insist that he has no association with or connection to Jesus. And so now here he is, reminded of that very first encounter, his life before Christ, a glimpse of what his life after Christ, with the scent of fish and charcoal in his nostrils, remembering the moment when he denied Jesus. Jesus holds up one of the fish and he says, "Peter, do you love me more than these?" We know he wasn't talking about the disciples, because in just a couple minutes, Peter is actually going to raise the question about what about the other disciples, and Jesus actually gets on to him. So Jesus isn't trying to create a contest between Peter and the other disciples. He's saying, do you love me more than this other life, the life that you had before me? Why would you want to go back to that now? Did you love that life more than the life that we were sharing together? Peter answers, he says, no, you know I love you, Jesus. You know I choose you, Jesus. In verse 15, Jesus says, then feed my lambs. And this happens over and over. It happens again in verse 16. And Jesus says, then take care of my sheep. Happens again in verse 17. He says, feed my sheep. Over and over and over, Jesus comes back to this idea. And so from that, we're just going to take three very, very simple principles, three very, very simple steps. When we find ourselves in that place, that familiar place of having, I've already made this mistake, or I've already been through one bad season, what is it we do? The first thing that we need to do is we need to engage our people, especially when you're a leader, or whether you're a parent, or maybe your roommates. We need to engage the people that God has put in our life, that he has asked us to lean into. Notice Jesus says to Peter, hey, listen, if you really love me, you're going to engage people who need my help, who need your help, who are aimless, or who are scattered, or who need to be brought together. And in the same way, we're encouraged to dig into our people. Now, if you're in small groups, you're a small group leader, if you're a dream team or some kind of volunteer team leader, or whether you're a project manager, the reality is when we find ourselves in repetitious seasons of struggle, or when we find ourselves back, lean into your people. And here's why. Number one, oftentimes they're dealing with fear, they're dealing with anxiety, they're dealing with frustration, and they need to be cared for. But not only do they need our help, but oftentimes the solution to our problem is actually with them. And not only can we help them in those times, but they can help us. So as we're coming out of this COVID pandemic, here at the Well, we're going through our second successive season of struggle. In 2019, the roof blew off our building, and we spent a year rebuilding our campus, and rebuilding our teams, and rebuilding our groups. And right on the heels of that, COVID hits, and now we find ourselves in the same place. And I'm telling you, lean into your people. Lean into the folks in your group. Lean into the folks on your teams. They need your help. They need your encouragement. They need your assurance. But they also have all of the tools, talents, and resources that you need as a group, as a team, to be able to do the things that God has placed in your heart, number one. Number two, you need to engage your leadership. Jesus isn't just giving Peter a responsibility, he's reminding Peter who he is. He called Peter to be a pastor, a shepherd of his people. And he's reminding him who he is. And oftentimes when we go through times of struggle, we just want to revert. Before Jesus, Peter had just been a fisherman. Life was a lot simpler, right? All he had to do was catch fish at night, sell them in the morning, and he got through the day. And sometimes as leaders, we forget that our life, our job is so much larger than just trying to get ourselves through the day or over this hump, that really we have been created for a specific purpose. And Jesus is calling Peter to re-engage that divine purpose, that divine life that they were living together, that found its sort of culmination in Peter being with Jesus at the Mount of Transfiguration, walking on water and being the first person to ever declare, "You are the Christ, the Son of God." And Jesus affirming in Peter that the only way he could have known that was if God himself had spoken that directly into Peter's heart. He's saying to Peter, remember who you are. Remember what you're capable of. Remember what you've been called to. Don't sell it or yourself short. Engage your people. Engage your calling. And finally, engage your people to engage. Inspire your people to engage. Encourage, call your people to engage through service and through outreach. And what do I mean by that? Well, in the same way that Jesus is trying to help Peter get back on track by doing what he's really created to do and being who he's really created to be, that's what our people need too. Many of our people have unplugged because of COVID. Many of our people have unplugged because of the social distance, or they haven't been able to connect around the conference room, around the break table, around the classrooms, the hallways, and so on. And people have felt disconnected. And many of the behaviors that made them uniquely who they were, or excited about what they were doing, or made them feel really alive, have kind of fallen by the wayside. And it's time for us to call them back. Call them back to serve one another, to look at how they can help other people. Call them back to be salt and light wherever they find themselves in the world, in the community, in the workplace, to begin to call our people back. That in the same way that God is saying to us, hey, engage, that we would say to our people, hey, it's time to engage. Engage your faith, engage your neighbors, engage your friends, engage your work, engage this project. It's time to come back. Find a way to serve. Find a way to help someone else out. And in the process, you'll find yourself working out of these seasons of successive struggles. You'll get out of that double dip. Well, thanks so much for giving me just a couple minutes to just share with you a couple thoughts from the life of Peter and how we can be thinking about moving out of COVID and back into regular life, or recovering when we've had kind of reoccurring problems or weaknesses in our life. If you have any questions, you can always reach us here at the campus. You can come by the office. We're open from 9 to 2. You can give us a call, 630-262-1083. And you can always reach out to me directly online at jerry@cometothewell.org. We would love to hear from you. We are praying for you, believing in you. We know that God has great plans in store. Thanks so much. Have a great day.